Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. And if you are a returning subscriber, hello, bestie. I hope you're having an amazing day. You see what happens when you subscribe to the Ethics Experts? You get a bonus greeting on every single episode. So absolute no-brainer to crush that subscribe button. We are here today with a very special guest for our very special 100th episode, the one and only Sherron Watkins. How are you, Sherron?
Oh, good. Thank y'all for having me. I'm quite honored to be on your 100th episode.
Well, thank you. Yeah, everyone talks about this podcast because this is the highest rated ethics and compliance podcast in the world. Globally. And we're super excited to get you on. So you first came on my radar when I was in undergrad, majoring in accounting and finance, when the whole Enron scandal collapsed, or when you speaking up and you showing that courage brought down one of the really, a golden child of the economy. So super excited to get you on. Our paths are converging here. We help a lot of ethics and compliance professionals. We talk to a lot of whistleblowers. And so, who better for the 100th episode than the one and only Sherron Watkins?
Thank you.
So glad you're here, Sherron. It's an honor to have you.
So let's just kind of dive in and jump in for people who've been living under a rock or people who are in the millennial or the Gen Z generation. Why don't we start with your story, how you kind of came to, how your name came to be in the headlines and what that path was like through that company?
Well, sure. I had been at Enron about 8 years, and frauds are quite often discovered when people switch positions. You're kind of like the person walking in the room saying, hey, what's this elephant in the room? And everyone else has been trying to put up blinders and not see that elephant. And I switched jobs, stumbled across horrible fraud. And I will say that Enron used a lot of complexity in their accounting shenanigans. And I quite often use the emperor's new clothes as an analogy about it, where you've got an emperor focused on clothes and not running his kingdom. And that really was Ken Lay, our chairman and CEO. He was focused more on politics, on, the outward image of trying to bring gas-fired power to developing countries. That's a little cleaner than coal or other things, just focused on the outward image. Swindlers in that tale I consider to be Jeff Skilling and Andy Fastow. Jeff Skilling was our chief operating officer and Andy Fastow was our chief financial officer. Yep. So I considered them the swindlers. But in that fable, you can't see the cloth if you're either stupid or not fit for your office. So sort of some intimidation around this. And that's kind of the way Enron operated. Jeff Skilling used to have a famous saying of, hey, that person isn't smart enough to get it. If you're asking too many questions, the person, we've hired the smartest finance minds in the country, the smartest accounting minds, legal minds, you're going to keep asking questions and show you're too stupid to get it. So what happened was I stumbled across this fraud, was dusting off my resume. I just was like, I've got to get out of here. And within literally 2 weeks after finding this fraud, Jeff Skilling quit the company. So I felt like, wow, that's probably, I probably know a deeper reason why he's leaving. Let me go speak with Ken Lay, chairman of the board. He's stepping back in as CEO. He hasn't been paying attention to the details. I thought Skilling's resignation gave me credibility. Like maybe now, you can believe this horrible thing I'm telling you, because why else would someone like Jeff Skilling leave their dream job? He'd been at the company for 10 years. He finally got the CEO spot January 2001. And 8 months later, he's quitting.
Right. So what was that like? What was the reaction you got like? And how surprising was that for you?
Well, it was I was really waking up 2:00 in the morning, unable to go back to sleep, rehearsing in my mind, what could I tell Ken Lay to let him realize that Arthur Andersen, this very well-respected auditing firm, had really prostituted themselves. It's hard to believe a firm would let, first off, you're really saying Enron's committed accounting fraud, but also Arthur Andersen has allowed it to happen. And, I thought I had the right memos, the right spreadsheets. But what was crazy about it, I had about 30 minutes with him, and he was listening and acting like, okay, he's taking me seriously. But near the end, he said, well, you think Andy Fastow is doing a good job, right? The CFO, he's doing a good job. And I was just dumbfounded. I'm sitting here telling you that your CFO has helped cook the books. How can I possibly agree with you that he's doing a good job?
Wow.
What a mind-boggling response.
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that you think he's so what you're saying is he's a good cook. He's great at cooking.
Yeah.
So,
he's managed to fool a lot of people.
Yeah, I guess he's good at something. So, leading up to that, Sherron, like, how quickly were you convinced of what you were sitting on? Because I imagine there are all of these people who had a sniff of this, knew that that it was stinky, turned a blind eye, just said, I'm sure someone else is checking that. Oh, we get an audit, so Arthur Andersen probably would have caught that. I may be misinterpreting it. What was your path to going from like, whoa, what's going on here, to like, I'm almost completely certain that there's a massive problem here?
Well, there's sort of a twofold answer to that question. First off, I started my career at Arthur Andersen and worked to being up to an experienced manager. I worked in both the Houston and New York offices. And that 8th year, when you're getting close to knocking on the door to making partner, they told all of us experienced managers that the number one criteria for you to make partner is if we took away your book of business, all your auditing clients, you could rebuild that book of business in 1 year.
Wow.
So they're saying salesmanship, is more important than technical proficiency or your commitment to auditing standards and accounting principles.
Right.
So I knew Andersen had lost its way. And then additionally, I had seen them sign off on some things in 96 that I thought were inappropriate. But when I started meeting with people concerned with these Raptor structures that I'd stumbled across, the answers were, once again, it's very complex, lots of boxes on a whiteboard, but the Raptors were supposed to be outside entities, and they owed Enron about $500 million. And the people explaining the structures said, well, the Raptors are going to pay Enron back by accessing and getting their hands on some Enron stock that's kind of in these structures, selling it in the marketplace and paying Enron back. And the stock isn't worth $500 million anymore. It's worth about 200. So there's a hole here, a $300 million hole. And I didn't hear where there was any outside money involved. Like, who lost money?
Yeah.
Enron's lost money. We haven't reported it in our financial statements, but the way we're covering that loss is, more Enron stock, selling Enron stock in the marketplace. Who's the third party that lost money? And people trying to explain it to me finally would just give up and say, hey, we're not accountants. Arthur Andersen's blessed it. It must be okay.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, because that was kind of my follow-up question to that. It seems like we talk within our company about this value of common sense, right? You don't need to have a PhD. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to kind of figure out, like, hey, at some point this is a closed system, so it's got to go somewhere. It seems like you had that common sense, but, I think my question is, C.S. Lewis has this idea of the inner ring, of there are people very close to something that know exactly what's going on, and then there are all these concentric circles of someone's kind of in on it, or, someone kind of has some blinders. What do you think was the range, I'll just maybe lead it here. I imagine not every employee at Enron other than you was completely in on it and had signed off on it. But what do you think is that mix of the people around you? I think you mentioned some people just saying, hey, we're not accountants. But, how does something this big happen? And where do you think kind of people around you could have noticed it or been brave enough to speak up and they didn't?
Well, and I think those are great points. That inner ring, the people that really knew that it was wrong, I'd say it was not even a half a dozen people.
Wow.
Ben Glisson was an accountant hired out of the accounting industry to work at Enron for Andy Fastow. And he helped structure some of these things. And he was one of the first to plead guilty. He I know this is bad. They're going to eventually find out it's bad. So I'm just going to be first in line and get the best deal.
Okay.
I just think not too many people were really understanding it. And it falls into that arena of just, this isn't my role. I don't quite understand it. But your point that none of this is that complex.
Yep.
Yeah.
And
Right.
if you can't explain it to a first grader, or if you're on the other side of the table and someone's trying to explain it to you, if they can't explain it, either they don't understand it or it's intentionally opaque, it's intentionally complex. Right. They are trying to just wear you down to where you just give up and do that diffusion of responsibility excuse. Well, Anderson's blessed it must be okay.
Wow.
So I think, and the reason that latter problem existed is Enron had a rank and yank review system. It was pretty brutal. You were evaluated twice a year. What have you done for Enron lately? So people that were not in the accounting department would just say, hey, I'm not getting good answers. I don't feel good in my gut about this, but I'm not in the accounting department. It's not my job. What have I done for Enron lately? I got to go focus on my next deals.
Right. Yeah, and you need a certain confidence interval or a certain courage to step out or step into something that's sort of outside of your realm. I mean, at the end of the day, I think people are most concerned about themselves, their personal safety or whatever, which can obviously translate into keeping their mortgage paid and keeping their kids fed and stuff like that. So it becomes kind of easy, especially on something that's intentionally opaque, to your point, for them to say, you know what, I can't really spend a lot of more calories on this. It's not even my area. Again, we have, one of the big five at that time, blessing the thing. So, kind of move on, keep your job, and don't fall at the bottom of that rank and yank hierarchy. You know what I mean?
Exactly. But, then the problem becomes, the Department of Justice has over 24 felons associated with Enron. Wow. And, only a handful are the perpetrators of the fraud. The rest are sort of unwilling participants, those people that weren't getting good answers, but just said, hey, it's not my job. Additionally, there's a whole host that had to pay hefty legal fees trying to make sure they weren't indicted.
Yeah.
So there was quite a cost to going along.
Yeah, and it's a cost that people don't think they're going to have to bear, is the point. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a bet being made at all times, right? You're making a bet on, hey, I'm not going to get in a bad spot from, not speaking up or, whatever the expected value of this sort of game is, so to speak. And boy, that can really go left when you're sitting there in the courtroom racking up, there's $10,000 per hour, probably more, when you look at your legal team sitting next to you with the legal pads. It's very fragile and it can fall apart very quickly. And again, I'm just fascinated by the Enron thing because it was like my first picture of, this thing that glitters is not actually gold, as I'm sort of learning about business and stuff like that. And it's recently a couple of things have been popping up on some social feeds of this Forbes picture, this Forbes cover of America's best companies, and it's Enron and it's got the CEO on it. And it's boy, this did not age that well. But again, from the surface, you don't know what's going on inside the company, just like you don't know what's going on in somebody's house. You know what I'm saying? You don't know what's happening behind those four walls, and you can't tell from looking at that glossy cover the type of incentives that leadership is sort of imposing on the organization, either explicitly or implicitly, by some of these tactics that we're talking about. I find it super interesting, though, that you go to the chairman, and again, I don't know these guys very detailed, but it doesn't sound like the chairman had that different of a view than the CEO. Do you know what I'm saying? The same tactics were kind of employed against you, maybe a different flavor of them, to kind of stiff arm you, to kind of shut you up, and so forth. So it's that tone from the top has such a massive impact on the lives and how people live out those lives throughout the organization.
Oh, you're exactly right. I mean, I back to the Emperor's New Clothes, I had Jeff McMahon, a former treasurer, encouraging me to meet with Lay. I had met with him and he told me some additional information. He said, I'll put a call in. I'll tell him you've got credible concerns and he should listen to you. I was encouraged to go meet with Ken Lay. And all this is between, Jeff Skilling leaving and a week later when I'm on Ken Lay's calendar.
Yeah.
And it's almost like I am meeting with Ken Lay saying, you're the emperor, you're being swindled, you've got on no clothes. And Ken Lay could have turned to the executives right underneath him and said, could she be right? Are we exposed? Have we cooked the books? But I think instead he turned to the executives around him and said, hey, we're paying Anderson $52 million a year to audit us, $1 million a week. I better be clothed, for that amount of money.
Yeah.
And they were like, hey, I'm sure you are. Anderson's the clothing expert, not me. So he sent out the vibe that what Sherron Watkins is telling me better not be true.
Right.
So I think people were ready and willing to kind of back me up, but then they read the tea leaves and backed down.
Yeah, and I think it, gets to core values that are so important to this, right? Like there are all these layers of how you impact a situation like this, right? It can be policies, it can be audits, it can be enforcement, it can be culture. But, I think within that answer is an expression of this value of she better not be right. Just like you were talking about that. At Anderson, it was like, you better get billings and you better be able to bring in revenue because that is the value that's going to win the day.
Yep.
And, I think that you saw that expressed in that answer, right? Where he's like, not, the value is not integrity or truth or, hey, let's make sure that like we come clean if we mess something up. The value is, hey, someone better protect me, which we kind of talk about as like compliance 1.0 of compliance and ethics. Like we talk about it being in the 90s.
Totally.
The 90s compliance and ethics was keep the boss out of jail, and it's progressed a lot past that. But that's like the epitome of this thing of like, hey, I better be protected here.
I know. And, on the whole ethics front, it seems like there's great tools to do employee surveys, to figure out really what's going on underneath the surface.
Yep.
But too many companies don't even want to know.
Right.
They don't employ these rather simplistic, not very expensive tools.
Keep the lie alive is maybe what some companies should put on their value statement. They want to keep the lie alive. They don't want to know. And it really makes it hard for whistleblowers. And we've had some other whistleblowers on the podcast, and we've had some chats with those folks. And many of them have said, I didn't know what I was getting into, but if I had the opportunity to do it again, I probably would still do the same thing. How do you feel about that decision that you made?
Well, it's very ironic that Enron's core values were respect, integrity, communication, and excellence. And on that communication value, the little notepads and desk toys that we would have was a Martin Luther King Jr. quote that our lives begin to end the day we remain silent about things that really matter.
Wow.
And so unpacking that quote, what do you mean your lives begin to end? And what he really means is, your soul is eroding.
Yeah, right.
Your ability to think highly of yourself, and what you stand for and what your purpose is, sort of erodes. And I've seen that with some of my Enron colleagues. The ones that, were not the ones, some of the ones that mentally are healthier are the ones that pled guilty and went to prison for a couple of years because they've kind of come to terms with their role in Enron's fraud. But the ones that weren't indicted kind of fought it. They're now coming out on the excuse that the government was abusive or, made a mountain out of a molehill. They're having to rationalize how they weren't involved in something bad. And that rationalization, I think, erodes your soul, causes stress and everything else. I think it's more, for me, I would do things a little more differently, but I think when an ethical challenge lands on your lap, you can't compare your life to what it was before the ethical challenge. It will never be that way again. A challenge is landed on your lap, and it's best to be fearless, to address it, to speak up and try to get it corrected, because that's the path where you're going to be most proud of yourself versus trying to cover up or ignore it.
Wow. I really love the way that you talk about that, Sherron, because, I think a lot of times when people talk about this or when people consider it, the distinction is, well, what is it going to cost me if I speak up? And how does that compare to what my life is going to be if I don't? And it's thought of like, well, hey, I had to deal with all of this, people slinging mud at me, and I was, kind of blackballed from the industry or whatever it is. Look at the cost of speaking up. But I love that you've highlighted the cost of not saying something is that erosion of your soul, that it's that rationalization that you bring up means that you have to carry around all this dissonance all the
That's
time of, you know what, I'm a good person. You know what, I do the right thing. You know, it just wasn't that clear this time, and you always have to do those mental gymnastics, and you have to carry that around all the time. So I love that you drew that distinction of the cost that you bear for not speaking up. Because I think a lot of times people focus on, well, look at all the stuff you have to deal with if you lose your job, and people are accusing you of this or stuff like that. But that cost on that other side is big, and I love the way you speak about it.
And that cost of rationalization, to your point, it like takes soul energy to keep that flywheel of rationalization going. And at some point, you're just a liar because you're just lying to yourself.
Yeah, no matter what you say to yourself.
Right.
And there's two examples of that within Enron, because Cliff Baxter did not like what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
He was the head of mergers and acquisitions at Enron. He resigned in May of 2001 because he complained about Enron doing business with the CFO's investment partnership. It got nowhere. He resigned. He's the one that killed himself. And his suicide note said, "Well, there was once great pride, now there is none." But he was actually one of the good guys. But did he beat himself up because he didn't go to the press or didn't go to the SEC?
Interesting.
After he left the company. But in his defense, in 2001, there really weren't good mechanisms for that.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the SEC didn't have their office of the whistleblower and things like that.
Which is mind-boggling in and of itself, by the way.
I know. And Ray Bowen was in the Treasury finance world. He had to settle with the SEC, neither confirming nor denying wrongdoing. He was banned from being a public company officer for 5 years, had to pay a fine. He was just getting out of that 5-year ban,
Mm-hmm.
and he died of a heart attack in his 50s.
Wow.
So there's a cost of doing the wrong thing or not speaking up. So it's really alarming. But on the flip side, if you turn around the Martin Luther King Jr. quote, you can say that your life begins to soar the day you speak out about things that really matter.
Wow.
And for me, you mentioned C.S. Lewis. There's a parable of the talents. This wealthy master leaves some talents with his servants, heads out. He comes back later. What'd you do with them? There's 2 servants that took a risk with the talents and doubled what they'd been given.
Mm-hmm.
And the message to them is, come and share the master's happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And the third one that just buried it and didn't do anything with it, it's not so good what's said to him. So that's sort of a, almost a mantra for life. Take a risk with the talent you've been given, speak up when it matters the most, and spiritually some amazing things happen for you. And I think that's certainly been the case for me. And I think it's been the case for other people that have taken a risk. You end up, I think you do have to be attuned to it, but I've really had some miraculous, cool, mystical things happen as a result.
Wow.
All the money that you get from compromising these values, that can buy you a really nice bed, but that can't buy you a good night's sleep. And so what's the price on that? The guy dies at 50. I mean, that's crazy.
I mean, stress had to be a factor there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I got a good question for you, if I do say so myself. So whistleblowers, are they born or made?
I think a little bit of both. I am just having a discussion with some other whistleblowing organizations about kind of it takes a village. Time Magazine put the 3 of us on their cover in 2000, Cynthia Cooper from WorldCom, Colleen Raleigh from the FBI. And of course, we're all 3 women, but we're also all 3 firstborn, primary breadwinners for our family, people of faith. But also, we the 3 of us grew up in small towns of less than 10,000, where it's kind of, I think that made us optimistic that our actions matter. You're a small child, you hear your relatives talking about, hey, did you see somebody dump trash in the vacant lot off Main Street? Call the mayor. There's sort of a sense that you can impact the health of your village. But on the flip side, you also can get caught doing something wrong. And I mentioned that in an upcoming article for Whistleblower Network News, that when I was young, I wanted ice cream sandwiches. And my mother said, nope, we're not getting that. And I went to the freezer section, opened up the ice cream sandwiches box, took a few bites of one, put it all back, and a neighbor saw it. So she told my mother she had to buy the box. I got in trouble. But they're sort of wrapped up in that, the embarrassment and shame that you brought on your family, that the neighbor saw you doing something so wrong that you shouldn't have done. And does that scare you into I'm going to stay on the straight and narrow path? And I had this conversation with my boss when I lived in New York, and he had a similar experience. He had been hired as a grounds crew person at Newark. His dad knew somebody. He was like 15, 16, got his first job. And the experienced grounds crew people told him how they take naps in between the runways and just, kind of don't do their work, take some naps. So he did it. He obviously didn't know which runways to choose from and which hour to take a nap. And some pilot saw his body, as he was landing. So needless to say, he gets fired. His dad's embarrassed. And he attributed that childhood transgression with kind of scaring him straight. So I think you're a little bit born with some idea of right and wrong, but I think those childhood endeavors where it's not your parents catching you, it's someone else catching you, and you kind of feel like you brought shame on the family, that helps create whistleblowers.
Yeah,
or at least people who are dedicated to the straight path.
Yeah, it kind of puts that seed in you, and you've seen that iterate a couple of times on this smaller chessboard, and when you get into this broader one, those same principles translate into these new dynamics and these new people and, more complexity and so forth.
Yeah, I think it's really cool that you brought up the dynamic of that small town, Sherron, because there's something that I think we're losing a little bit as the world progresses the way that it does. The average company size is bigger. The reach of what you can do through the internet and where your customers are, like everything's kind of dispersing. And that kind of small town feel of, the butcher and, who runs the corner store and, your families have been together for 3 generations or whatever, that some of that is lost. And there's something about that type of culture where I belong to a community. The things that I do matter. The way that I behave is not just it. What hangs in the balance is not just whether I get in trouble for it or not, and that kind of tight calculus of, hey, is it worth it, to speak up for this? But there are a bunch of other people who are going to be impacted positively or negatively by the things that I do, and I think that if you live in too dispersed of a culture, you grew up in a massive city where you never saw anybody again, you pass people on the street and you never see them again. I think that's something that corporate leaders would do well to foster and say, hey, you know what, this is our tribe. Hey, these are the people who matter, whether it's our customers or our community or our employees or whatever it is, that can get some more of this integrity, right? Like integrity is these things all match up together, right? This stuff is all tightly intertwined. And I think that when it becomes too transactional, it becomes too much every man for himself. And do I have a contract that's going to force me to do this? You lose a lot of that ability for someone to just do the right thing because they know it's going to matter, even if they can't draw a straight line to, how their income is going to be different a month later. I love how you've brought that into the conversation because that sense of community is a key to ethics. Right. And I don't think that everyone always ties those together.
No, I think you're exactly right. I mean, I'm a big proponent of internal audit being internal. Enron outsourced their whole internal audit department to Arthur Andersen loan staff. I mean,
how does this look? Yeah, it looks great. All right. Clean glass. Yeah. Double bill.
Here's a check.
Double bill.
But the way it works informally, there's always those get-togethers. This is the new class of 2022. You might be going into internal audit. Someone else is going into sales. But they have all those new employee get-togethers. There's even rotations. So what ends up happening are those really powerful, informal lines of communication because, David and Tom know each other really well. David ends up calling Tom and says, you're in internal audit. When you're coming into my department next quarter, I want you to pull these 5 transactions to review. You didn't hear that from me. I want you to look at it. So the internal audit ends up catching a problem, stopping it, and that's because they're all in it together.
Right.
The guy in sales tried to do it the right way. Something's gone wrong. He's letting his buddy in internal audit know, I want you guys to catch us.
Yeah.
And so it works together to keep things on the tried and true.
Yeah.
So then where do you think the idea or the ideal of loyalty comes into this discussion about whistleblowing and speak up culture and doing the right thing?
Good question.
Well, I mean, I personally think whistleblowers generally are loyal to the company, but they want the company to be doing it the right way. They're almost looking down the road and saying, what we're doing now is wrong. It's going to be a rough patch, but we've got to come clean. We've got to correct this for the long-term health of the company. So I don't think they're disloyal. That's a bad rap that whistleblowers get. But I will say that the Dodd-Frank Act that has this reward program for tips, referrals, complaints, it greatly increases the likelihood a company will be getting caught if they do something wrong. So I'm hoping that provides an incentive for companies to focus on their ethics, compliance departments, their risk management, their internal audit departments, because they're just not likely to get away with it like they used to.
Yeah. When you were going, I want to dive back. Let's go back in the Wayback Machine. As you were meeting these people before all of this popped off, what kind of vibes were you getting? Any sniffs you got to it, or was it really just sort of like bottom up, you looking at this bizarre whiteboard and not being able to get an answer, and your analytical mind kind of saying, this kind of stinks? Was it a confluence of things? Was it kind of a mosaic that came together, or was there a particular moment where like the light bulb went off and you're just like, like the scales fell from your eyes or something?
It's a little combination of both. I mean, the first meeting where these business unit guys were really explaining the Raptors, and there's no third party person involved. It's just Enron.
Yeah.
I'm shocked. I'm concerned. I'm dusting off my resume. And 2 weeks later, with Jeff Skilling quitting, I write first an anonymous 1-page memo. My assistant drops it off an employee Dropbox because Kinley was holding this huge company-wide meeting to address the shock of Jeff Skilling resigning. And I heard all the right things in that meeting. I go and identify myself, but it's a whole week later that I'm going to be on Kinley's calendar.
Right.
And in that week, I start putting out feelers to colleagues and employees, coworkers that I trust. And I got an Excel spreadsheet from one person that showed, more evidence of the wrongdoing. I got a PowerPoint presentation that had been presented to the board of directors. That was another piece of information.
Right.
And so I've got a dozen people kind of feeding me stuff. Yes, here's more. And did you know this happened or that happened? Include this in your talk with Kinley. I meet with Jeff McMahon, and he's like, yes, go speak to him. So feels like there's this huge amount of support. My mistake is I should have gotten at least 3 of these vice presidents or managing directors, like myself, to go with me. I was at the vice president level. Managing director is above that. I should have gotten 2 or 3 more to go in with me, so I wasn't one lone voice. But a lot of those people dropped me in the grease afterwards when they realized Kinley did not want to hear what I was saying.
Wow. What did that feel like?
It was shocking. Well, fall of 2001 was awful.
Yeah.
Just absolutely awful, because I was dropped in the grease. I didn't see Enron forming this crisis management team, and 9/11 happened.
Right.
So everything just felt very, unsettled.
Yeah.
That's an understatement.
Yeah.
So was that safe to say that was one of the lowest points in your life, or one of the biggest battles of your life?
It clearly was, because it shocked me that more people weren't stepping forward and really saying, yes, this is wrong.
Yeah.
And
that's a big one.
Yeah. And it was very disappointing. I lost a lot of respect for people that I had admired, or at least, liked and respected. And it was just very disheartening.
Yeah.
And I really was a little bit shocked, because I use the Titanic as an example too. I'm the crew person that sees we've hit an iceberg, water's pouring in, we're going to sink. Lights are on, band's playing, but we're going to sink. And so you go warn the captain, you're expecting the alarm bells to go off, business lines to be saved, hoard cash. And instead, you hear nothing. And you really see the people in charge kind of elbowing their way into the wheelhouse. Who's going to be the next captain of the ship?
Right.
And you're like, so you want to be the captain of a sinking ship?
Yeah, I want to go down with the ship. Yeah.
I really, my emotions were very much probably like a crew member that found it to be shocking that nobody was sounding the alarm bells.
And what do you attribute that to? Like, I'm sure, you don't have just a statistical split, but like, how much of that do you think people were in denial? You think people, kind of didn't want to let a good thing, didn't want to let their job go.
Right.
They were kind of in some plausible deniability, or you said diffusion of responsibility. Like, what do you think is that mix? Because I think it's a really interesting perspective. There are a bunch of people in this ethics profession who are trying to prevent things like this from happening. They give people training. They implement policies. They're trying to do their audits. There's a mix of different personalities and perspectives and boldness and, adherence to integrity around you. Like, where do you think that line was in the people around you?
I think they had grown comfortable with Enron's past successes.
Right.
There have been some people that have compared Enron's situation to also NASA's with the Columbia shuttle loss, wow. Where NASA had foam strikes, you chunks had fallen off, hit the shuttle, and it had provided, it didn't cause any problems. And so the big foam strike that hit a vulnerable part of the left wing, there was a NASA engineer very concerned about that, but he got nowhere because there was just such a, we're fine, that's not going to be a big deal. And he even predicted what was going to happen with that shuttle, that, if it really did what he thought it did, it chunked off some of the heat shield. Upon re-entry, that blasting heat was going to bore a bigger hole. They would lose all sensors from the left side of the shuttle, and within seconds lose communication with the whole shuttle, which is what happened.
Right.
Wow.
And with Enron, I think there were people that just, we're Enron. We'll get the right lines of credit. We'll get the right, liquidity, kind of bully our way through it. The company wrote off those Raptor structures, or at least they announced that they had in an earnings release statement mid-October. And it was just not something you can do accounting wise. It's kind of like robbing the bank. And then when the police stop you, you just say, well, here's the money. I haven't used any of it yet. Here it is. Sorry, you're still going to be arrested. It was just something you cannot do. And so that kind of struck me, that who in the world is advising Ken Lay? What lawyers, what accountants are sitting around telling him that this is the best avenue? I mean, I thought he could form the crisis management team, face the music, or keep the fraud going. I never thought they would try to write it off as a current period, non-recurring write-off, which literally, accounting wise, is like trying to hand the stolen goods back to the police and saying, it's all there, no harm, no foul.
Yeah. I love that you bring in that issue of, that hubris or something of, that might be a problem, but I'm not going to get into it and we're going to be fine. It's almost like, to have a broad culture of ethical conduct, there needs to be some humility that we are not above reproach. This, a scandal is not something that we are completely insulated from, and that would never happen to us. I think that that's an interesting angle and something to try to impress upon the culture of, don't assume that like the music's never going to stop playing, because, it can happen to anybody.
Yeah. And life is fragile, and everything's fragile, and everything can fall apart. So, I mean, Enron's not even a going concern anymore, irrespective of all the accolades they got and the golden boy of business and all those kinds of things. It's not even around anymore. It's a punchline at this point. You know what I'm saying? So everything.
And Arthur Anderson's not around.
There you
anymore.
go. Mm-hmm. There you go. I mean, yeah. So I want to talk a little bit about what that next sort of chapter was like. So you kind of sniff this thing out, you get some good intel, some good insights, and as we talk about this, I'd love to hear about some of the other things that you would have done differently, because we're always in this sort of conflict and battle of like, we want to give people a way to speak up, to voice concerns, we in our business, we want to hear it all because reality is our friend and so forth. There's some disconnect that happens as a company scales, but as you're going through that next chapter, you talk to the chairman of the board, things started moving, and then at some point you have this label as a whistleblower on you. I don't know how long that took, but what was that next stage of your journey like?
Well, so Enron wrote off those Raptor structures in an earnings call. They actually never filed their third quarter financial statements. And the very next day, the Wall Street Journal had an expose article. They had someone giving them information. There's a whistleblower that was giving the Wall Street Journal some information. And they hit Enron with front page expose articles that Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And by Friday, the SEC was conducting an investigation. Enron really went radio silent. They didn't explain themselves very well. And the stock price just spiraled further down. We went from like $33 a share to 9 cents by the end of November.
Wow.
Lots of shareholder litigation filed, problem after problem. And the company declared bankruptcy December 1st or 2nd. It was on a weekend. And on December 3rd, on Monday, people are, pulled together for big floor meetings, and their managers tell them, hey, last Friday was your last paycheck. Go back to your desk, clear out your personal items and go. No severance pay, no medical insurance. And I phoned up the head of HR. I really had no real job. So I had been working for Andy Fastow on the 49th floor, which was, part of our executive suites.
Mm-hmm.
And I was moved down to HR on the 16th floor. No real assignments in this limbo period of during the investigation, quote unquote. And, the head of HR said, Sherron, if you didn't get a call over the weekend where you were asked to stay on to work for the bankruptcy estate, you're gone too, And I had been asked by an in-house lawyer to meet with the law firms that had been hired by Enron in all these shareholder litigation. So they had a law firm representing Enron's board, a law firm representing Enron, the corporation, a law firm representing Enron executives. And he had me meeting with these lawyers. Now I understand that he had told them eventually, the plaintiff is going to find Sherron and find out what she's saying. So this is kind of like what the opposing side is saying.
Yeah.
Can you understand it? So I was kind of, being used to help defend Enron, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But this in-house lawyer said, don't leave the building. Let me see if I can get you one more month of employment, because, if you're walking out the door, you're going to be hunting for a job. And I really would like for you to still continue meeting with some of these law firms. So he saved my job that day for about a month. And mid-January is when Congress found all that material that I'd given Ken Lay in August in a box of subpoenaed documents. There were about 11 congressional investigations that were looking into why, a company the size of Enron had never really reported a losing quarter, and poof, they go bankrupt. Mm-hmm. And shareholders were holding stock worth $60 billion at the beginning of 2001. So in 1 year, a company goes from being worth $60 billion to nothing. What happened? And Enron was not trying to hide information as much as drown Congress with too much. They said they just were receiving, rooms full of boxes, and some poor congressional staffer was probably stuck in a basement, just going through everything. And when they found my memos, they released it to the press. But they also did some very direct subpoenas, like, we're going to ask Vincent and Elkins, the law firm, what did you do around these allegations? Arthur Anderson, what did you do around these allegations? Enron, what did you do? So it kind of opened up the discovery process almost. And that's when I was subpoenaed to testify in front of Congress.
Did that feel like some vindication for you?
Well, it was that, and the most vindication came about from something known as the Powers Report. Mm-hmm. And when Enron was totally falling apart, our asleep at the switch board of directors finally hired an outside law firm, an outside accounting firm to investigate my concerns and to look into a few other things. And they added Bill Powers to the board, and he was running this investigation. And Bill Powers was the dean of the School of Law at University of Texas at Austin.
Mm-hmm.
And so this report has his name on it. It's known as the Powers Report. And they filed it early February 2002. And that really vindicated me. It basically said everything I had claimed was true, and there's even some more rotten stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that felt safer. I was no longer the one lone voice that was saying Enron had committed fraud.
Yeah, I mean, how different would your life have been if that staffer didn't go into that archive box? I mean, have you thought about that before?
Well, yeah, it'd be very different, because I think I would have worked at Enron maybe a month or two more, and then I would have been part of that 5,000 trying to find, a job.
Yeah. So you definitely took the scenic route. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, walking into Congress, what was that like? I mean, it's kind of this interesting dynamic that you were kind of a part of, because it's almost like the allegiance can differ between your country and your government. And, what I find is that whistleblowers, to your point, are some of the most loyal people. They're some of the most conscientious people. They're the most value-driven people. And they're really being super loyal to this idea of what the company is, or the idea of what the company is supposed to be, as stated on its values page or on its mission or something. Mm-hmm. And yet there's this sort of paradox where management is maybe pushing in a different direction due to their own self-interest or something, where there's this sort of like, and I think this is why a lot of whistleblowers get blackballed, which I'd love to talk about a little bit. Mm-hmm. But there's this interesting sort of dissonance between like the source of the loyalty, and sometimes you think you're working you're trying to be loyal to the company when actually someone has sort of taken advantage of you. And I think we saw an example of that as you were kind of brought in to help kind of build the defense. When it became clear to you that, okay, hey, there's kind of nothing to save, there's no way to save this sinking Titanic, and then you're brought into Congress, what was that like walking in there? And as you look down the path where you're like, okay, I'm kind of in the grease now. These guys pushed me in the grease. What were those feelings like when you're like, how do I get up out of this thing and kind of land back on my feet?
Well, it's interesting because Congress did subpoena Ken Lay, our risk management person, Richard By, Rick Causey, our chief accounting officer, Andy Fastow, and they all pled the fifth. They went there, they held up their hand to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But when asked questions, they said, I'm pleading the Fifth Amendment.
Yeah.
Jeff Skilling did testify. He was the only, one of the only few executives, but a few others did too. The lawyers testified, Jeff McMahon testified. And what I found in watching and paying attention to their congressional testimony is they sure had trouble recalling a lot of things.
Uh-huh.
I just don't recall that, or yes, I know I wrote that down, but that was 4 years ago or 2 years ago. And for me, when I was called to testify, you're sworn to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And so I kind of felt like I sure don't want to lie.
Yeah.
If there's truth that I know, I'm supposed to tell the whole truth. So it was a lot of testimony really pointing out where the problems were. It kind of helped mark the prosecutional trail on where Enron had problems. And at that point, Enron was already bankrupt. You're really wanting the truth to come out. So the guilty people might be held to account, but there might be some lessons learned from it.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I want to kind of dive into the label, and very few whistleblowers that we've spoken to would say I wouldn't do it again, because they're just those kinds of people. Mm-hmm. But how difficult was your life after you stood on your principles, and how long did it take for whatever negative label or whatever that was attached to you for, oddly, paradoxically, doing the right thing to kind of fall off? You know what I mean?
That's a great question. I'm the only whistleblower that has a great story. All that congressional testimony, Time put us on their cover. I had immediate speaking requests, all over the country. And, I've been to some fantastic places around the globe talking about leadership and ethics. So I have a very good story, able to make a living on the lecture circuit. But as I sought out corporate employment, those doors would be shut. And even I used to live 2 blocks from Rice University and looked at participating in some of their executive sessions and their executive training. And it looked like it was a big, wide open door of opportunity until that door was slammed shut. So I think it's taken almost 20 years for the full troublemaker aspect of it to wash off. I mean, as I mentioned, I'm now the executive and residence at Texas State University. First full-time job in 20 years.
Wow.
So that's a long time, for that label to be washed off.
And do you think that was a function of the time? Do you think that was the function of the era that we were in? Or do you feel like if, hey, Dodd-Frank's in place now, if you were kind of, if it was happening now, do you feel like the world is sort of more, like responsive to this? Like, or do you still think like if that happened today, it would be 2042 before that label fell off? You know what I'm asking here?
Yes, I do. Well, the beauty of Dodd-Frank is it does allow a would-be whistleblower to contact a lawyer and remain anonymous. Mm-hmm. And the SEC really works with that lawyer to try to make sure that their investigation and their inquiries within the company don't pinpoint who likely, told them about the problems. So it would be great. They get a reward and they can hopefully stay employed at their company and their company starts doing the right thing. But to me, it's always been kind of hard to understand why. But I spoke at a conference in 2003 at the Aspen Institute, and I met Bob Monk, and he and Nell Minow started Institutional Shareholder Services. They're in this kind of corporate governance leadership space. And this was a reception, cocktail conversation, but he said, you and Cynthia Cooper, she's from WorldCom, you guys will never work in corporate America again. And I'm like, what? Particularly Cynthia Cooper, who was head of internal audit and did everything the right way. What do you mean we're not going to work in corporate America again? And he said, people just see you walking down the hall and you make them feel bad. Something deep down in their subconscious says they probably wouldn't have had the courage to speak up like you did. So you just make them feel bad and they can find that skill set somewhere else.
Wow.
Wow.
And
How
so
crazy.
maybe that's it. But maybe that's it.
Yeah, I don't know. Like it really doesn't make sense to me that, there's some psychology there of like, I feel guilty. I'm not as righteous as you, hey, let's get someone else. I kind of feel weird. Maybe that explains it. I think a lot of people in our market, people who are ethics experts, compliance leaders who work in governance and audit and all of that, I think they see this the right way and they see, hey, you know what?
Oh, no,
go ahead.
I completely agree with that. I mean, I think people that are in this space would love to have me, love to have Cynthia Cooper. And I also think 90% of the people within an organization would be very excited to have a whistleblower. But it's just that one person in leadership that just nixes it. Yeah, it's just that one or two person in the organization that's near the top that just says, do we really know what their motivations were? Can't we get this skill set elsewhere? There's just too much baggage here. I think most of the people in the organization would be happy to have us. It's just that one or two, and they happen to be powerful enough to squash it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting perspective because I think a lot of people in our space who are ethics experts say, hey, you know what? I'd love that. And if it's so hard for whistleblowers to get hired, I guess everyone else is against us, and we're just kind of way on the other side of this line of integrity. And I think you illustrate it well, Sherron, that there are a bunch of people who would be for it, but there's some politics and there's some power structures, and there's some of that old boys club of, hey, you know what? Let's just not mess with this, which is really unfortunate. And maybe it's changing, and maybe the culture is changing. But I think part of the challenge with this whole whistleblower conversation, and the travesty that you haven't had a full-time job for the past 20 years because of this, is there's this tyranny of the minority, that it does not have to be a majority decision to not employ a whistleblower. One or two or a handful of people can scuttle that whole thing, and then it's like, all right, start the recruiting process over again.
Right. Yeah,
exactly.
And as an executive, I think I can say this, but there's an oversampling of sociopaths at the executive level. So
what?
So the odds of someone being like put off by somebody who's quote unquote more righteous is just going to be higher. And again, there's more power concentrated there. It's just this bizarre paradox, because some of our best teammates are people that have been whistleblowers in other places, and we're definitely proponents of hiring whistleblowers and trying to like erase this stigma, because I don't know, it's, I guess unless you're trying to hide stuff, you don't want these people around or something,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the natural assumption, is like, oh, well, I guess if I can't get hired here, they must be trying to hide something. They must be unethical. Or I just imagine that some people, I've wondered that myself, like, how can nobody want Sherron Watkins to work for you? Right. She's going to be honest. She's going to stand up for the right thing. It's not going to be a fox watching the hen house. But I've wondered that same thing. Like, okay, well, do they have something to hide, or they just don't want to get in the fray? But I think that dynamic of it can just be a couple people who are uncomfortable, or someone who casts some vague aspersions on your character and says, well, maybe maybe she's just bitter and she wanted to take them down or something like that. It doesn't take a lot to kind of mess this up.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, this has been a really fun conversation. I don't know. I've, like I said, I saw you when you were testifying to Congress, and I was like, wow, this is freaking amazing. Look at the courage that this person is exhibiting. And again, you kind of jump off the cliff, and you don't know where you're going to land. You don't know how long this label, how you don't know the implications of it is my point. So it's great to talk to you. It's great to pick your brain. I feel like this could be like a 3-hour episode, but it's been a lot of fun to hear your insights. As we part ways, I have 2 questions for you. One is, if you could go back in time to Sherron before, we talked about it a little bit, but go back before that, to a young Sherron who's maybe just coming out of undergrad or something. What advice would you give yourself? And then separately, what advice would you give somebody who's witnessing some kind of malfeasance in their company, but is a little bit scared to speak up and speak out about it?
Okay, great questions. Well, I do tell college students, see why people are excited to work at an organization. What does the CEO say? You're really looking for leadership that really loves the products and services that they're producing. That they're really, what they talk about, is their employees, their customers, their products. I mean, you can think about Steve Jobs.
Mm-hmm.
He was always talking about, the iPod music or the latest Mac. It was always about the products. And Jeff Skilling was always talking about our stock price. And I think also, if people were to say, oh, why do you work here? You're interviewing for a job at Enron, why do you work here? Well, at Enron International, people would say, it's very, very inspiring and kind of fulfilling to go into a developing country that lacks reliable electricity and help, build electric plants, where people now have, water wells that run or the creature comforts that we just take for granted.
Yeah.
If you ask some of the traders or some of the people that were in the areas under Jeff Skilling, you'd hear more about you're going to make more money here than you ever thought you'd make. It's all about what you were going to be taking home. So the wrong motivations. And, so you're really, what motivates you to work here is a great question when you're interviewing, at companies. What makes them excited to come to work? And if it's all about stock price and personal compensation, wrong place.
Yeah.
But in terms of, one thing I want to point out for people who find wrongdoing, I just love this reward program that's part of Dodd-Frank with the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower, because really 10 to 30% of SEC fines now go towards whistleblowers. And that has attracted legal talent to the cause of the whistleblower. So someone runs across a problem, they can actually, just Google whistleblower legal help, and they'll find some law firms that can give them some great advice, help steer the course, help map a plan for them. And sometimes maybe they haven't found something wrong, and they'll be able to bounce ideas off these lawyers to determine, okay, maybe I haven't found anything. But the beauty of it too is, I first stumbled across very aggressive accounting at Enron in late 96. And what Enron adopted as fair value accounting in 96 was really the seeds of the later fraud. Mm-hmm. And I did speak to some Arthur Andersen colleagues. I got in trouble. I spoke internally that I was against this. I would have contacted a lawyer. They would have contacted the SEC. The SEC would have come in, slapped Enron on the wrist, fined them. Enron would have stayed on a straight and narrow path. And I want to point out that I wouldn't be thinking, wow, I saved Enron from bankruptcy. And the SEC wouldn't be thinking, we saved shareholders from losing $60 billion.
Right.
So we need to be respectful that the small things that get stopped are really perhaps preventing a huge problem. And I think that's one of the main problems with ethics, compliance, risk management departments. They don't get credit for the huge problems they've prevented.
That's great, Sherron. I'm so glad you brought that up, because that concept that it's hard to value, or you just can't value the thing that you prevented, is really a big struggle that I think we have in ethics departments and in this profession of, we're doing great work all the time.
Right.
We're preventing fires. There's a lot that we've discussed on the show about the cost that you bore as a whistleblower, but the cost of this fraud, what was it, 5,000 people having to go look for new jobs, moving their families around, not making income, all of the shareholder loss there. That's the real thing that, we're working all the time to prevent. And it's so hard to really say, hey, you know what, if I hadn't done this, then 3 years from now, there would be a $50 million fine. But we have to get into a place where we can advocate to our board, our leadership, to our finance departments around, this is important, and this is what's going to keep us from that big problem down the line.
Right.
And just as we wrap up, Sherron, I appreciate you bringing up that difficulty in valuing what you prevent. And I just want to say that for all the costs that you've borne, for all of the time that you've spent not on your normal career path, kind of dealing with all of the challenges that come, you've been an inspiration to me. I know that when I saw this happening, I was like, wow, I can't imagine what that would be like to go up against that Goliath and say, hey, you know what? This is the right thing, and I'm going to say the right thing, and deal with the consequences. I think a lot of times we talk about how, whistleblowers, have this reputation, and, how should we deal with it? There are a lot of people, and, it may not be the CEOs of all the companies. There are a lot of people that see what you did and said, you know what? I want to be like that, and I want to be someone who stands for what's right. And I really appreciate you modeling and living out those values so the rest of us can see, hey, you know what, it can be done.
Well, thank you. That's very kind words. Warms my heart. I appreciate it.
Where can people find you? Where can they find your book? Where can they sneak? Where are you giving classes? Where can we sneak in and steal a lecture here?
Yeah.
Well, I am going to be doing obviously I'm full-time at Texas State in San Marcos, Texas, but I do teach a weekend course at UNC up the road from you guys at Chapel Hill. I did it last February, and I'll be doing it this coming February. That's for MBA students at Keenan Flagler there at UNC.
Awesome.
Very cool.
And so I'm, I think these podcast opportunities are wonderful as well. So I like the idea of getting the word out about, to would-be whistleblowers.
Yeah, there's so much magic that can come from digesting the fact that reality is our friend and empowering people and giving them a voice to be these human sensors in our organization. Only then can we truly start to crowdsource risk management. This is not a game of sweeping more dirt underneath a rug and hoping that, it doesn't feel too lumpy as we're walking across it. It's about having a clean floor. You know what I'm saying? So,
yes, exactly.
So anyways, until next time, thank you guys for joining us.